giving you a voice,
making it loud our own way.
Welcome to the fun.
In a previous show, we had Mike Corsetto from Citrus Circuits on. His birthday was yesterday, so happy belated birthday, Mike. And he had an interesting quote to say. He said, quote, "I think there will be a full-on strike before Minnesota goes to districts." Well, guess what, Mike? A new nonprofit has formed in Minnesota, including North and South Dakota, called First Upper Midwest, or FUM, which is funny to say out loud. Can we come up with a better acronym, please? Our producer, Tyler, sat down with one of the founders of FUM, Steve Peterson, and let's take a look and have a short discussion after. So go ahead and play that video, Tyler.
Hey everybody, we're checking in with Steve Peterson, who's from the new First and Upper Midwest, we'll call it consortium, nonprofit maybe. Steve, how would you describe something like this?
It's really a nonprofit that's focused on FRC in our area.
Well, let's talk about that, and let's just jump right in. You mentioned FRC, so I want to talk a little about why it's needed in FRC and in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and of course this involves these three states. So let's start out with that in regards to what led to FUM. It's going to take me a few times to say that to fully get used to, especially with fun, by the way.
That's right, fun and FUM. So.
And how that works, yes. But why was this needed? What was the decision-making process that went behind this?
Well, I've been an FTA and FRC for a couple of years, and we have been steadily expanding the off-season event program in Minnesota. People may not realize it, but we actually run 6 off-season events now in Minnesota, which is a pretty decent-sized off-season event program. We run and they're everything from big FRC regional style productions. And a good example of that is our partnership with the State High School League and the State High School Championship that we run. That's done in exactly the same location as the 10,000 Lakes Regional. And it's done to that same kind of quality level that you're used to seeing at a regional. To off-season events like the video that we have up here right now from the Minnesota Robotics Invitational, that was yesterday up in Roseville, Minnesota. As we've been growing our off-season event program, it's become pretty clear that we need to start being more organized about just kind of setting up and organizing those events. We have a bunch of work that goes into kind of volunteer management around that, but also we've started buying equipment. We need to buy supplies and do things like that. And it became obvious to me probably during last year's off-season events that we needed to be more organized about that.
So when you said it became obvious, looking between how does it integrate in regards to the regional directors and the regional chairmen and that sort of thing? How does that whole relationship work out?
So you have the regional directors and you have the regional planning committees that are focused with the on-season kind of the official events, and they're very supportive of us doing the off-season events. But the off-season events really fall almost entirely on the local volunteers.
Yeah, it's very individual based a lot of times.
Yeah, they're very individual based, and so. And this is one of those things where I have a habit of opening my big mouth and saying, "Hey, we need to be more organized around this." And people finally came to me. Yeah, and people finally came to me. And a lot of things, if you see a problem, and we talk about this a lot of work. If you see a problem, it's your job to go figure out what a solution might be for it. And really kind of starting this organization is what that's about.
So a big question to ask, and this has been asked, I think, a few times, but we do want to definitely clarify, is that there's been many talks of districts, non-districts in Minnesota in regards to FRC. So in many cases we've seen prior, establishing a nonprofit, at least in regards to FRC, has been kind of that transition, that first step to go to districts. So where does that conversation lie in regards to FUM, and where do you see that moving forward maybe in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion around districts, and I think it's not that there aren't folks who are interested in having districts. I think you need a certain level of organizational capability in order to make districts work.
Especially Minnesota, where you have 200 plus FRC teams, no doubt.
Yeah, and so if you look in Minnesota right now, I talked a little bit before about how we operate 6 off-season events. Well, if you kind of look at the numbers for Minnesota and the nearby areas that would probably be part of the same district, you'd need to be able to run at least 12 events, which means 2 events every weekend for the whole competition season. And right now we run 6 events basically once a month. And so if you look at the number of, and there's a lot of volunteer overlap between those events. Yeah. And so if you think about where the scale that we have to get to really a different scale than where we're at right now.
And it'd be almost an on-off switch in many cases, right? Because either you go districts or you don't.
Yeah. And so you have to basically go from, because right now, if you look at where our kind of volunteer base ends up going, and We have the Great Northern Regional. That's a new regional. It's in its second year up in Grand Forks. We have the two sets of double regionals. We have the Duluth double regional and we have the Minneapolis double regional. Those are actually good prototypes for what you might need to do for a district event, because we have a massive volunteers enough to run 2 regionals at the same time in those locations. And then we have nearby regionals. We have the regional in Iowa, and we have the regional, the
Seven Rivers
regional in Wisconsin, which are nearby, and they have a certain amount of overlap between our volunteer base. I would say from a leadership standpoint, those areas have their own regional planning committees and run run their show that way.
Yeah. Many in which in Seven Rivers are from Minnesota.
Right, right. And so people ask, does this say that Minnesota is going to districts? And the answer is it absolutely does not. I think it's up to really the board of this organization. And,
so I want to jump. There's 2 key points you touched on there. One was in regards to Iowa and Wisconsin. So how did that conversation go in regards to Iowa and Wisconsin maybe not joining this, or was that something that wasn't really even discussed?
Well, so what I did basically this spring and summer is I ran a series of conversations with the FRC community involved in the events that we kind of talked through and said, here's what we're thinking about doing and here's what the initial focus is. Is this something that you think you would be interested in being involved in right now at the startup? And what we heard from the folks in Wisconsin and the folks in Iowa was that, we're going to wait and we're going to watch what you end up doing. And it may be that we decide to join up with what you're doing later. It may be that we're not going to join up at some point. The key thing that I wanted to make sure is I didn't want to have us, for example, decide this was a Minnesota only thing, and for the neighboring states that have low population density, which are North and South Dakota, and having them feel like they're left out of things.
Because they would be, for sure,
Right. And so we had conversations with people involved in the FRC program on the North Dakota side, and they were definitely saw a lot of synergies between what we're doing. That Grand Forks regional could just as easily be plunked on the other side of the border. It's 2 miles from the border of the state.
And so is Seven Rivers in Wisconsin, being from Wisconsin.
Yeah, and Seven Rivers in exactly the same situation. And so we care a lot about those events. And in South Dakota, the situation is a little bit more ambiguous.
There's one team in South Dakota, right?
Yeah, there were 2. I think there were 2 last year, and I think there's 1 registered right now. And it's in the western part of the state, and that team likely has a really strong affinity to Colorado regional, because that's just the natural place to go. There's a lot of desire to try to develop a set of teams in the kind of central and eastern part of South Dakota to kind of come participate in what we're doing. And so one of the things, for example, we might start doing is maybe we can go figure out how to run an off-season event in the western part of the state, maybe over in Marshall, Minnesota, over toward the western border, and start getting folks from that are interested in potentially starting teams to come see the off-season event and do something like that.
So 2 things I want to kind of wrap up with a little bit is talking about, you mentioned the Woody Flowers Finalist Awards in regards to a nominating committee. Could you just give a brief description of that? And then there is a call on October 18th. Is that available to the public, or who can listen in, and what is it going to be about?
Okay, so your first question was about the nominating committee. And one of the things that I'm very specific about saying is that this organization is the community's organization. And I have an org chart when I go and talk to people about it that actually has a board of directors, and sitting above it, it says FRC community in a box. So it's super intentional and clear that that's the case. And the 3 people who were involved in starting this were Mark Lawrence and Lori Shimizu and me, and we were talking about what was the best way to kind of represent the communities in that. And the idea that we came up with is that we're going to start by using a nominating committee that's the Woody Flowers finalists, because if you look at kind of community exemplars in first, that's really that's
who represents first, right?
That's what they're intended to represent. And so we're off recruiting basically folks who are active in FRC who are willing to come and being part of the nominating committee. And their job basically is to review the set of applications and say, we think this would be a good board. And we want to make sure that we have a board that has program participants, board that has people with lots of nonprofit experience. We want to make sure that we get a variety of people there. And also people who understand that the board is a governing body. So one of the things I say at the meeting is, when I talk to people about it, is if we're at a board meeting and one of the agenda items is who's buying tape for the off-season event on Saturday, then we're doing the board wrong.
It has to be high level, right?
Yeah. And so the board's going to be a very high level. It's not going to meet super often, probably 6 times a year if what I'm proposing ends up sticking. And so I'm trying to be really open-ended about it, and sometimes it frustrates people because I'm deliberately vague. But it's really up to the community to decide what the priorities are. And so,
well, I think you're being open about it to start out with, and you're just saying, hey, we haven't really developed this yet, but I want to let you know what's going on.
Yeah, and oftentimes, it's easy. You'll hear from people, why can't you be more specific? But if you're more specific, then you hear from people, well, that doesn't represent my view. And so it's hard to satisfy everybody. I've decided to come down.
You never will. That's the reality.
We're going to maximize. We're going to maximize the community input in this up front, and that's really the higher bit for me to go do that.
Sure.
So you had 2 questions. What was the other question?
On the October 18th call, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that'll be open to anybody. The tech stack that I'm using to run it can support up to 250 people. So if more than 250 people show up, I probably won't be able to.
Now, when you say anybody, like, are you encouraging, I would assume, people from the Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, or I mean, somebody from California who maybe really is interested in this sort of thing, can they jump in, and is that appropriate?
I think anybody. I don't really care who's in the call.
Sure.
It'll be focused on kind of the Minnesota conversation. So I'll be honest, I'll care more about the input from people in the area that we're trying to serve. But I think we're happy to have anybody listening to what we're doing.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to inform the community what's going on. I really have to applaud your proactive forwardness in this, even though not everything is set. I think me as a community member appreciate hearing that sort of thing, and it does give us time to dissect it a bit, but on the other hand, you are being straightforward. So appreciate that. Wish you best of luck in regards to FUM, and I hope to have you on again sometime. Thank you, Steve.
Let's not take too much time on this, but this is definitely a good decision for Minnesota, North Dakota. Or do you think it is a good decision for Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, regardless if districts are in their future? So what do you guys think? We'll do a thumbs up or thumbs down vote here. Good? Yes? I'm gonna say it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Thumbs down, I can't see. Maybe.
That's a step in the right direction, I think.
Yes.
I agree.
I would agree. Partnerships are good things.
Yep.
Thank you to all of our co-executive producers, keeping fun loud, live, and independent. Pledge your support. Go to patreon.com/funfrc.